Hello, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. Welcome to our special presentation celebrating women's achievements and honoring our hidden heroines, particularly during Women's History Month. Today, we're in for a treat as we commemorate this important day with a deep dive into the life and legacy of Matilda Joslyn Gage, a pivotal figure in the women's suffrage movement right here in central New York. Joining us for this enlightening discussion, we have Dr. Danielle Nagel, Executive Director of the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation, whose passion for Gage's work is truly inspiring. Adding an extra layer of authenticity to our event, we're particularly delighted to welcome Matilda Joslyn Gage herself. And so without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Danielle Nagel and Mrs. Joslyn Gage. And as we journey through the history to celebrate incredible women who have helped to shape our world.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matilda Joslyn Gage, and I was born in Cicero, New York, to a doctor, and I was homeschooled by him. And I also wanted to become a doctor someday. And where did I apply? Geneva College. I was not accepted, but a few years later, somebody named Elizabeth Blackwell was accepted. She was accepted by a vote of the male students. And then a few years later, she graduated at the top of her class. Then the professors came into view and said, we can't have this. We cannot have another woman graduating in the future at the top of her class, so we have to close this to women. And they did. So I wasn't able to become a doctor. I got married to Henry Hill Gage, and we from Cicero also, and we moved to Syracuse for a while, and then to Fayetteville, where my home is today. He had a general store on a feeder to the Erie Canal. The back of his store was right up against the feeder, so things could be unloaded into his general store. He was a great husband, and I had 5 children, but I did have help with the house. I did still can and do all kinds of things like that, but I had time to write and become in 1876, the year of our centennial, the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Now, notice we say suffragist in America, and in England, we say suffragette. So I also was chairman of what is called the executive committee, which meant that the organization was run out of my Fayetteville home. I decided the day-to-day activities. I decided the publicity. I decided the letters that would be written, my articles that would be sent out throughout the whole United States. And I had a newspaper as well that was shared with the public in the United States. So I was actually running the organization before and after 1876, because that was a job I took, and I could do it at home, which was really nice. But my husband was just a wonderful man, and we had trains then, so that I could get out and speak nationally as well. My first speech was in 1852 in Syracuse, and we had a train that went from Fayetteville to Syracuse, so I could do that. I didn't leave my oldest daughter at home, Maud. I took her by the hand and we both went up there, and I read my speech, which was immediately printed as a tract of the National Suffrage the National Women's Suffragist Association. And so I got a lot of visibility from that, and it really added to what we had to say about the right to vote. You know, we didn't get the right to vote till 1920, the 19th Amendment. But I worked towards that with my colleagues, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And Susan was always at my house, and Elizabeth sometimes, because we would meet there. In fact, Susan had her own room that the kids called Susan's room. And she used a diamond ring that she had and etched her signature, still visible today, upstairs in the library. So it was a great time for us. And you'll notice that I'm wearing white. Who wore white last night? Did you notice who wore white last night? Many of the women for the president's State of the Union speech, in solidarity with what you call the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which has passed the entire Senate and the entire House of Representatives and has been ratified by 2/3 of the states. However, we have to have another vote. Why do we have to have another vote? Because this amendment deals with women. So therefore, and it also had a stipulation that it had to be ratified by the 39 states by a certain date. Now, no other amendments have that, but we do. And so we have to get it on the Senate floor so that the senators will vote that, yes, we can have this amendment and we will vote again. And if it doesn't pass, then we'll know who is against it. But remember, the ERA is for men and women. You cannot pay women less than men, but you can't pay men less than women for comparable work. So it's an amendment for everyone. Would you come and visit me sometime for tea? I'd really like that. Now, if you look, where should they look, Danielle? You'll see my address on Genesee Street, which you call Route 5. It's just after the town center in Fayetteville. You go up 2/3 of the way up the hill on the right, big Greek revival house. It's just gorgeous. I love it. So if you have 8 or more people, I will be there and give you a personal tour. But we are open today, this afternoon, noon to 4, and also tomorrow, Saturday, and every Friday and Saturday, noon to 4. You'll get to see a nice 9-minute film that's an overview of my life and what I stood for. And you'll get to see the 5 rooms restored by Stearns and Crawford, noted architects. And each one represents something that I stood for. We have the women's rights room. We have abolitionists. You can be in a hidey hole there. And we have shackles if you want to try them on, but don't lock them. We lost the key. Just kidding. And you can go in religious freedom. I was a strong proponent of the separation of church and state, the Haudenosaunee Iroquois room, because women in the Iroquois nation, Haudenosaunee, led the nations. It wasn't decided by the men who would be chief. We decided, and they came to visit me all the time. Finally, we have this wonderful parlor that I had with original furniture. And guess who got married there? My daughter Maud, who came up for the 1852 speech, and L. Frank Baum. So if you want to see where they were married, it's there today. And also we have a wonderful gift shop. If you like buttons that say good things on them, we have wonderful buttons and all kinds of gifts and Wizard of Oz things. The buttons are only $2. You can't get them anywhere else. So do come for tea and I'll say hello to you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Matilda Joslyn Gage.
I have to leave right now. I'm so sorry, but I only get to leave for a certain amount of time. And so I have to go back up, up there. So I'll say goodbye and be
Thank you.
well and prosper and come visit me.
And now, without further ado, we have Dr. Danielle Nagel.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm glad we had that lovely introduction and surprise visit by Matilda. So she gave a really good overview of what I'm gonna talk about in more detail today. So first, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Danielle Nagel. I'm the executive director here at the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation. I have a PhD in environmental science from SUNY ESF. And so the thing that has really interested me about Matilda's work in writing is her work on women in science and how women often didn't get credited for their scientific inventions, and women in the past, having worked as doctors and they were doctors, they were herbalists, they were doing all of these things, but they weren't getting credit for it, or the church was demonizing those activities as witchcraft. And so I'm interested in bringing out more of those stories in Matilda's work and the stories connected to the environment, especially because she was so closely connected with local Haudenosaunee communities. And so bridging together these social issues with environmental issues, I think there's a really exciting possibility to do that in Matilda's work moving forward. And the Gage Foundation has there's a really strong base that, because of Matilda's work, because of the work our founder, Dr. Sally Roche Wagner, did throughout her life. And part of how we like to start these sorts of talks is acknowledging that we are on the sovereign land of the Onondaga Nation, and that this land holds the cultural DNA and spirit of the first people of this place, the Haudenosaunee people, or the people of the Longhouse. So Haudenosaunee is the proper term. Iroquois is the French name that was forced onto Haudenosaunee peoples, and so we try to use the word Haudenosaunee here to honor Haudenosaunee people's wishes for how they would like to be called and referred to. So we stand in solidarity with the Onondaga Nation and their support for their continuing struggle for the recognition of this land as theirs. And we are committed to the work to dismantle the doctrine of discovery, the papal bulls which gave religious sanction to the taking of land by European Christian settler peoples. This commitment is in keeping with the mission of the Gage Foundation and to follow Gage's instructions, quote, "Upon you has fallen the glorious task of bringing liberty to the earth and all the inhabitants thereof." And so our mission today is really to continue Matilda's work and to educate current and future generations about her work and its power to drive contemporary social change today. So as Matilda already shared, our museum is not your typical historic house. We are in Matilda's home, but it's not set up as it would have been when she lived here. It's really dedicated to her ideas. And so right now I'm sitting in the women's suffrage room, which is the room where Matilda and the other women of the National Women's Suffrage Association met and did their work. And so this is a really powerful space in that sense. And then we also have Haudenosaunee room, a room dedicated to religious freedom, as Matilda was really fighting for or advocating for the separation of church and state, which I'll get into a little bit more in my talk. We have the Underground Railroad room because this house was one of 2 homes in Fayetteville that were open on the Underground Railroad. We also have some local history components and our Oz parlor where L. Frank Baum married Matilda's daughter, Maud. So it's very different from your typical historic house museum. And the tours try to emphasize conversation and dialogue and not just giving people a script to follow. So as I go through this presentation today, don't feel like you have to agree with anything I'm saying. You can add in your own perspectives and information that you think might be pertinent. I really would like to Zoom can be tricky, but if we can foster some dialogue during this, and I'll leave some time at the end for questions and stuff, that would be really great. So, has everyone heard of Matilda? Is there anyone who has not heard of Matilda before? Okay, so some people have not heard of, there's a few people who haven't heard of Matilda, some people who have, so we've got a great mix here. This is perfect. I love talking to people who know about Matilda because sometimes they share things with me that I don't know yet, and then meeting people who haven't heard of Matilda, which was my experience and before I came into this position. It just opens up so many interesting aspects of history that we haven't heard about or talked about before. And so Matilda, I'll share a little bit more just about her as a person. She was a radical activist for human rights in the 19th century, and she lived right here in central New York. She worked alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the women's suffrage movement, but she was written out of history because her views were seen as more radical. She even, before she separated from Stanton and Anthony, though, she co-authored the first 3 volumes of the history of women's suffrage with them. And so she was really active with them, and they were a triumvirate, but we only know 2 of the 3 names today. And I also like to highlight Matilda as a person. She was a mother. She was an artist. We actually have one of her original artworks here and some prints of her other artwork. She was an organizer, a researcher, a writer. Like she did so many things, and she had a lot of support during that but I like to think of her as a whole, you know, to try to bring her as a whole person forward. And I feel like sometimes it can be intimidating to hear these stories of women who are doing all of these amazing things and this really powerful work. And then just remembering too these other aspects of their life. And so Matilda has actually been called by Gloria Steinem the woman who was ahead of the women who were ahead of their time. So Matilda's words in some ways speak more to today than perhaps they did back during her time. She was one of the earliest champions of women's rights in America. She was a lecturer and writer who was well known throughout the country. And she had a distinctive personality, decided convictions, independence of thought and action, a courage of opinion, and she was very gifted in the use of language. She was a forceful speaker, but at the same time, she had a warm and sympathizing nature that made her a friend and a help to the poor and a kind neighbor. But again, she was forgotten from history. Her role and contributions have largely gone unrecognized. Even with some of our high school volunteers, I've asked them in their AP US history course, did Matilda come up? And they said, nope, no, Matilda's not even in the textbook. So she's really still largely being written out of history, although the work that Sally has done has brought her more into not just our local consciousness, but she is more globally known. And there's a lot of work around the Matilda effect, which was a term coined in the 90s by Margaret Rossiter. And it reflects women being written out of history or not getting credit for their contributions to the world. And that's actually the exhibit you see behind me. These plates here, some local artists actually use that idea and design these plates to highlight women, not just in the past, but also in the present, who are doing really amazing work and not getting the credit they deserve for it. And so, as Matilda shared, she was born in Cicero, New York on March 24th, 1826. Today, it's near the intersections of Route 11 and 31 near Burdick RV. So there's a historic marker there and there's a small graveyard, I think, in that area too, where I believe that's where her father is buried. And so you can still see some pieces of her life around the Syracuse area. Her father, Hezekiah, was a physician and founding abolitionist of the Liberty Party, and her childhood home was part of the Underground Railroad. Her father held a lot of his meetings there. He took her on rounds, his medical rounds, and he would make people answer her silly little childish questions, as they would sometimes be perceived. So he was really a strong influence in encouraging her to think for herself and not let her gender or, societal gender norms prevent her from being the person who she ultimately became. And so I really like that. Just warms my heart, that aspect of like a father supporting a young daughter in that way. And I don't know, that's just one of my favorite parts of this story that I get to share with all of you. Her mother, Helen, was also an accomplished musician, and she had a passion for historical research. And so you can see some of her art and also her passion for historical research herself coming through her mother's influence. And so, yep, she wanted to be a doctor, but she was denied admission to Geneva Medical College because of her gender, even though her father lobbied very strongly on her behalf. And then it was in 1852 where she first spoke and became a prominent person in the women's suffrage movement. She spoke at the Third National Women's Rights Convention in Syracuse. That was her first public address, and she was 26 years old with 3 small children at the time. And so just to give a little bit of a broader context for Syracuse at this time, the village of Syracuse was incorporated in 1825. And the population was only around 2,500 people. And I think that's specific to settlers. I don't think that's including Haudenosaunee peoples who are still living in the area and the population. And so Matilda being born in 1826, she's born right as Syracuse is starting to pick up and become more of a central city, especially because of the construction of the Erie Canal between 1817 and 1825. And so the Erie Canal really increased transportation, communication, industrialization of this region. And then the population grew to almost 50,000 by 1870. So this is what's happening at the same time Matilda is growing up and starting to speak publicly about women's rights. We're really seeing a time of rapid change, increased population growth in this area of New York State. And the other aspect of that story, though, that I'm going to try to, weave in some of these parts of history that get left out, because Matilda was close with the Haudenosaunee, advocated for Indigenous rights. The Erie Canal was actually enabled largely due to breaking of federal treaties. And so there was the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua, the 1613 Two-Row Wampum Treaty, and dozens of others that had to be violated in order to take the land to construct the Erie Canal. And DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York State at the time, actually fraudulently made treaties between the Haudenosaunee and New York State. And so one of the things Matilda was really trying to educate people on during her time is that Indigenous nations are their own sovereign federal entities that should be seen on a nation-to-nation basis. And it was actually illegal to make treaties between New York as a state and these sovereign Indigenous nations. And so that's sort of a little tidbit into the background of the Erie Canal and how it came to be. And I think that even though Matilda didn't talk specifically about those examples, I think they give some good context for the later work that she did. And so that's Syracuse during that time. Matilda and Henry have 3 children, and they decide to leave Cicero and moved to Fayetteville in 1854. So this is the home. This part of the home that I'm in now wasn't here, the Greek Revival part. They actually added that on to a small cottage that was here. And we have some old maps of what the property used to look like with the garden and things like that that are really interesting as well. And so they were actively benefiting from the Erie Canal, the prosperity of Henry's dry goods stores. That's what really made Matilda's critical activist work possible. They had Irish servant girls in the house helping to support the household. And it was a really, this part of Syracuse there was a lot of wealthy people living in this part of Syracuse. Grover Cleveland lived across the street as a young boy and actually did some work on the Erie Canal. There was a famous opera singer who lived not far away. So Matilda was really living in a very wealthy part of the area during that time. And so as she started to speak more openly at that first convention where she spoke, a more conservative press actually labeled the convention satanic. But they pursued on, and Matilda became the president and founding member of the National Women's Suffrage Association, running it from this home in this room, as I've mentioned. And she also edited and published the organization's newspaper, the National Citizen and Ballot Box, from 1878 to 1881. So she was really during this time, she was collaborating with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they were doing really powerful work in strategizing how do we work with government to not even working with government, but kind of just using the strategy, political strategies to get women the right to vote. And so there was a lot of debate during this time. Should it be a state issue? Should it be an amendment issue? And there was actually a suffragist, Virginia Minor, who was from Missouri, and she voted illegal. I mean, she said it was legal, but it was decided her vote was illegal, citing the 14th Amendment, but she was denied by the Missouri legislature. And so she actually sued. And Matilda was part of the strategy. The idea was that they would sue based on the 14th Amendment, arguing that that amendment gave women the right to vote, and take it to the Supreme Court. And so, but Virginia herself couldn't sue because she was a woman, so her husband sued on her behalf. And it did go to the Supreme Court, this case, and it failed. So Matilda was actually the person who was strategizing how the suffragists could respond following that failed court case. She looked to the Amnesty Act of 1872, thinking that if we can forgive Confederate soldiers and give them the right to vote, why can't women who have been loyal to this nation have the right to vote? But then in 1874, the temperance movement became more prominent, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union formed and became involved in the suffrage movement. And Matilda was very concerned about this because she was so strongly advocating for the separation of church and state. And so she attempted to stop a merger of the National Women's Suffrage Association with the American Women's Suffrage Association, because the AWSA had a lot of support for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she believed Frances Willard, the president of the Christian Temperance Union, was, quote, the most dangerous woman in America, due to her desire to remove the wall of separation between church and state. And so Matilda saw the church as a primary source of women's oppression. And she saw this merger that happened as really problematic because it ultimately functioned in a way that enabled white women to leverage Jim Crow laws to fight for the right to vote for white women, while not also advocating for the rights of Black, Indigenous, and other women to have the right to vote. And so that was where Matilda really broke away from the movement. She was unable to stop the merger. And so the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed, but she separated off and she formed the Women's National Liberal Union due to her concerns regarding the church's restrictions on freedom, particularly the freedom of women, as well as the willingness of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was supported by Susan B. Anthony, to push the vote forward for white women while at the same time ignoring the rights of women of color. And so this gets back to Matilda's childhood influence in abolition and her home being part of the Underground Railroad, her father being a founder of the Liberty Party. She says, I quote, "I think I was born with a hatred of oppression." And she was really outspoken and advocating for that's why we say human rights, because it wasn't just women's rights. She was really fighting for everyone to have the same rights. And so this home here in Fayetteville was also part of the Underground Railroad, which I think I may have already mentioned. And Reverend Jermaine Wesley Logan, he actually asked Matilda to offer her home. And this was during the time of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And so she was really she was one of only two people who opened their home to freedom takers who were making their way to freedom on the Underground Railroad. She risked 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine, which would be about $40,000 today. And she said it was one of the proudest acts of her life. She was not afraid to make radical moves to support human rights. And she was really outspoken about slavery. She said there will be no permanent peace until the cause of, at this time, the Civil War is destroyed. And what caused the war? Slavery and nothing else. So she really pinned the Civil War on the issue of slavery. And she was also supported by people like Frederick Douglass. He published a lot of Matilda's essays in his periodical, The North Star, because other periodicals wouldn't publish her writing. It was seen as too radical. And so she was really navigating a very complex environment to get her ideas out there at a time when women's ideas were not being valued. And it was similar with Indigenous rights. Dr. Wagner has talked about how early suffragists were likely influenced by the matriarchal society of Haudenosaunee nations. They saw women having all of these rights that they didn't have in more of a patriarchal structured society. And that connection influenced, or, it gave momentum to suffragists fighting for women's right to vote in the United States. And at the same time, advocating for separate Indigenous nationhood. I have a little excerpt here from that National Citizen and Ballot Box paper that Matilda helped edit and write for on Indian citizenship is the title of it. And she's talking in here, she says that the Indians have been oppressed are now is true, but the United States has treaties with them, recognizing them as distinct political communities, and duty towards them demands not an enforced citizenship, but a faithful living up to its obligations on the part of the government. And she was talking about all of these things back in the 1800s. And she understood that critical piece that Indigenous nations are their own federal nations. And so that's something that I think we've kind of lost over time and need to start bringing back into people's awareness so that we can all live together in these places in peace, right? That's what this is about, peace and a regenerated world and balance. That was Matilda's ultimate vision. And so in 1893, she was actually adopted into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation because of her support for women, for Indigenous rights. And the name she was given in English translates to "she who holds the sky." So that gives you a sense of who she was as a person and how much she was doing to advocate for human rights. And then towards the end of her life, in 1893, she wrote Woman, Church, and State, which is it's like the book she wrote at the end of her life that just says everything she wanted to say. And so it's a really powerful piece of writing. Definitely a little dense because of the 1800s, but it shows you just how excellent of a researcher she was at a time when like women didn't have access to do research a lot of times. And so it's a really interesting book. It synthesizes her lifetime of research. She talks about topics from labor exploitation of women to child sex trafficking, the church's strategies to control knowledge, domestic abuse, the occult, the witch trials. And it begins, so she covers a whole range of topics, but she really grounds it in the first chapter of the book, which is called The Matriarchate. And that's where she's trying to bring this idea of the matriarchy forward. She's talking about the church and how it's more patriarchal, and that if we can bring matriarchy back into balance, we could have a more regenerated world where people can live in peace and friendship together. And so this is where I still have to do my own research more into this part, but this is where I see where she's talking about women in science, women's roles and contributions being ignored throughout history, and how that's affected our knowledge about the world, about history. She talks about how, here's a quote from her book where she says, at the time that witchcraft became the greatest ogre against which the church expended all its terrific powers, women doctors employed anesthetics to mitigate the pains and perils of childbirth. The use of mitigating herbs assailed that theory of the church, which, having placed the creation of sin upon woman, still further inculcated the doctrine that she must undergo continual penance. And so these women doctors who understood herbalism and how to mitigate the pains of childbirth, that contradicted the church's narrative with the story of Eve and original sin and the pain that women should experience during childbirth. And so this church science piece, I think, is something that's really interesting in Matilda's work that hasn't been pulled out as much as some other aspects. And so that's what I'm really interested in looking more into. But because her book was so radical, it was press banned by Christian nationalists. And so we see that again still today. I have an example here recently from North Dakota, where a school district superintendent sent an email that called for a Christ-centered republic and declared his district will continue to teach the Christian heritage and origins of the American Republic. And so this is the separation of church and state piece that Matilda was really advocating for. And we still see this as an ongoing struggle today. And then the last bit of my talk I want to touch on here is just the connections with Matilda and the Wizard of Oz and some aspects of her later life. So as Matilda mentioned, her daughter Maud married L. Frank Baum, actually here in the front parlor. So that is a room where we have some original items from the family, Matilda's paintings, some photos that L. Frank Baum actually took. And Matilda encouraged him to write down his stories. She was the one who had a strong influence in his writing of Dorothy as a character, a young, independent woman. There's no love interest. She's the strongest one in the group of all these grown men. And so you can really see how Matilda's influence shaped his writing of Dorothy as a character. And even I just learned this recently. This was really interesting to me, that actually the Oz books were banned in 1928 for depicting women in strong leadership roles. And so when I heard that, I was like, this is so interesting with this connection to book bans and Matilda's work. Yeah, so the Oz connection has been the most surprising to me. A lot of people don't know about that connection to Matilda, but there's a really interesting way that it brings into the story. And people, what I've seen so far in my time here is that people who haven't heard of Matilda, the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, that can be a really good entry point for people into connecting with her and learning about the story. And that speaks to just how much her influence is still present today. The Wizard of Oz is known globally. Somewhere Over the Rainbow it has to be one of the most famous songs of all time. And it's amazing to be in this home and think none of that would have necessarily happened without Matilda and who she was as a person. And the more difficult piece of this story that we also like to highlight is that Baum actually wrote several genocidal editorials in the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer following the assassination of Sitting Bull and the Sand Creek Massacre. And so I have some of the quotes here. He said, "The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. And having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth." And so this question comes up a lot. How did Baum write those editorials if Matilda was his mother-in-law? And I obviously don't have an answer to that. But I hope that through time, she was maybe able to talk to him and change his views. And some of that is what we see in The Wizard of Oz. But we can't ignore this past and this connection to the history and the family. And so I see this as just a complex aspect of this story that can't be ignored. Sally actually, with a couple descendants back in 2006, worked with the Sioux Nation and did a formal apology for these editorials. And so we do have some information on that as well, but they still exist. They still cause harm. They still impact people. And so I think what Matilda's story has been teaching me is that, like with the Erie Canal, there is a much more complex and often violent history to the Erie Canal that we don't hear about. And Matilda was benefiting financially from the Erie Canal, and she's also advocating very strongly for Indigenous rights. And so to me, what I feel her teaching me in that is just, it's all part of sorting through these issues. We can't ignore the things that make us uncomfortable. We have to be willing to speak our truths and move forward and find ways to move forward together so that we can create that world regenerated and balance that she envisioned. And so she actually spent the later years of her life in Chicago with Maud and L. Frank Baum. And then she passed away in 1898 at the age of 72. So just 5 years after writing her book, Woman, Church, and State. But her influence, even though she was written out of history, her influence still exists. It's coming back into the global consciousness. We have the Matilda effect. I see a lot out in the world on the Matilda effect and women not getting credit for the work that they've done. And then a lot of the issues she fought for are still relevant today. I mean, right now I'm thinking about a reproductive justice dialogue series for May and June, because we're coming up on the anniversary of Dobbs. And we're just seeing, I mean, the recent decision in Alabama with determining through IVF that embryos are children. This is a really relevant issue right now. And Matilda was talking about these things back then. She said, "Enforced motherhood is a crime against the body of the mother and the soul of the child." We're seeing a lot of states now putting near total or total bans on abortion. And so that's just, one example. There are a lot of examples, but that's one that I think is really key for the next few months or so, and probably beyond that. But I want the Gage Center to be a space for having these dialogues about difficult topics. And through, The Wizard of Oz, Matilda still continues to influence the world. Dorothy has touched the world with her spirit of empowered courage and common sense. And through her, Matilda Joslyn Gage, the mother of Oz, lives on. That's a quote from Sally, our founder. And I was even thinking with, Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road tour, and Oz is so influential for the gay community, and just like, it blows my mind how global this impact has been. And so even though she's been forgotten out of history, her work and life still live on in many different ways. And so, and her home currently here, we're a museum, but we're more of a social justice dialogue center. And so our tours are not scripted. I People come if they want to just go around on their own, you're welcome to do that. Sometimes people want a more guided tour, and sometimes people just want to walk around together and talk and ask questions. And so we try to be open and fluid and create a space where people can feel like they're at home in Matilda's home and engage with her ideas and think about how her ideas are still relevant today.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you. So I guess now, does anyone have any questions or anything you'd like to share? Anything that surprised you about Matilda, or things about Matilda you may know that I didn't mention?
If I may, I hear about Haudenosaunee and the influence on the women, and in this separation of church and state, and I'm reminded, because I only learned a few years ago, that our Constitution is based on the principles of the Haudenosaunee.
Yeah.
And so many people say no, it's a Christian state, but I said, it was based on Haudenosaunee principles of democracy. So don't tell me that that it came out of the Bible. It came out of the Haudenosaunee, and I don't know if she addresses that at all in her book, talking about not only the influence on women but also the influence on men of these democratic principles.
I haven't come across that in her book, but that is something I know. The Scano Center, the Scano Great Law of Peace Center, they talk about that. But yeah, that the Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, all of these founding fathers were actually talking to the Haudenosaunee. They wanted to understand how, at the time it was, no, there were 6 nations at that time, how they managed to work together. And so they spoke with the Haudenosaunee, and they took a lot of those principles and put them into the United States democracy. But the key difference is they just selected some of them. So like the matriarchal aspects of Haudenosaunee democracy, yeah, those didn't get included. And so, yeah, there are historical letters and documents. I think maybe Lawrence Hoffman goes into this in his book, Conspiracy of Interests. That's one I'd recommend if anyone hasn't read it, that kind of he goes through treaties and laws and tells the history of upstate New York from a very different perspective than we're used to hearing. And so he might get into some of those pieces with democracy in his book. But yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because we don't know. We assume, oh, the US created this democracy, but really it was heavily inspired and informed by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So they are actually the oldest living, still functioning democracy.
Oh, Molly?
Yeah, I want to highly recommend Sisters in Spirit, which is the book that Sally Roche Wagner wrote about Matilda, and specifically about the Haudenosaunee. And I mean, I was blown away by this. I actually purchased it at the House Museum when I went on a tour there. And it's really interesting because it talks about the interaction between the settler women and the Haudenosaunee. And the settler women liked to go on the reservation areas because rape was unknown in the native culture. Whereas in the settler culture, it was unfortunately a common risk. So women could not go out on their own except when they went to the reservation. And that was very, enlightening to me. And then they would have dialogue with the Haudenosaunee women, who would kind of chuckle and say, you have no rights at all compared to what we have. I mean, what do you have to teach us? We have a matriarchal society where we have a say and we're the last word. And what about you? So there was actually a very interesting influence that I was unaware of the Native women on the suffrage movement, because there was a living example of women ruling. And that was not shared amongst the settler women. And I think it inspired them to fight for their rights.
Yeah, that's a lot of what the current exhibits in our Haudenosaunee room draw from Sisters in Spirit, Sally's work in Sisters in Spirit, and even things like clothing. And Haudenosaunee women having more free-flowing clothing where they could move around easier, and more of settler women, there's corsets and those restrictive clothing. And Matilda draws a lot of those connections to the church as well. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that, because that's a really good point. And it just shows how much of these stories, how much is written out. That's like, that's what the Gage Foundation to me is about, is talking about these aspects of history that get left out because they're so important.
Does anyone else have questions or comments for our speaker?
I just want to say I have never heard of her and all the history classes or anything, and this was extremely enlightening. Thank you. I shall pass it on to my daughters.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. And please reach out, come visit us at the house.
I'd love to, but I live in California and it's a little difficult. But I joined this because I have Onondaga County ancestors. And so this is another aspect that I can attach to some of maybe researching them, because they were there and they moved to Onondaga. I think they came from Connecticut in 1804, so early in that area. So,
yeah.
Extremely enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And we're hoping, part of what I'm hoping, because we have so many people who aren't local who are interested in this story. And so virtual programming is something I want to try to build up for us too. There's been interest in virtual dialogue series. I'm trying to put together some speaker series. So
Is there anyone else with any comments, questions, thoughts? Okay.
I will add one other thing too, that I learned about it through Sally Roche Wagner presentation, and she is on YouTube in some occasions speaking about this, even with some of the members of the Onondaga together, and I found those also very informative. But this is given me much more information, so thank you very much.
thank you. I really enjoyed getting to speak with all of you today. I appreciated everyone taking the time to make it here today, and I hope that you are able to stop by the Gage Center sometime.